Imagine a place where silence screams louder than voices, where every sunrise brings fear instead of hope, and where humanity itself seems to disappear. That place was Tadmor Prison, a fortress of terror that the world will never forget. Tadmor Prison, known in Arabic as Sign Tadmor, stands as one of the most infamous symbols of brutality in modern Middle Eastern history. To understand why this prison became such a feared institution, one must first examine the deep layers of its origins, its location, and the unsettling transformation that turned it from a simple military structure into one of the world's most horrifying detention centers. The story of Tadmor begins far before the torture chambers, before the secret executions, before the political prisoners who vanished behind its walls. It begins in the lonely desert heart of Syria, a place where emptiness and silence stretch endlessly across the horizon. Located near the ancient city of Palmyra, Tadmor sits in one of the most historically rich regions of the world. Palmyra itself was once a thriving oasis city, home to the legendary Queen Zenobia, and a central trading hub connecting Persia, Rome, and Arabia. Travelers who visit the region often describe the landscape as hauntingly beautiful. Infinite stretches of golden desert broken only by ruins that whisper stories of forgotten civilizations. But just a few kilometers away from these majestic relics stood a structure that told a completely different story. Unlike the glory of ancient Palmyra, Tadmor Prison represented decay, repression, and the darkest corners of authoritarian power. The prison was not originally built for the horrors it later became known for. In the 1930s, during the French Mandate period in Syria, the site was used primarily as a military barracks, intended to house troops and secure the region. Its remote desert location made it strategically useful, isolated enough to protect military operations but close enough to Palmyra to serve logistical needs. The French had no intention of creating a torture center, yet the bones of what would become a fortress of suffering were already in place. Thick walls, long corridors, and austere rooms were designed with military strength in mind. When the French left and Syria gained independence, the structure remained, waiting silently in the desert. As political tensions grew in Syria throughout the 20th century, shifting alliances, coups, uprisings, and ideological battles, the purpose of Tadmor began to evolve. What started as a military outpost slowly turned into a detention center. The location was ideal for a government seeking secrecy. Far from major cities, surrounded by the emptiness of the Syrian desert, unreachable by ordinary citizens, and shielded from the eyes of journalists or international observers. A prison placed within a desert creates an immediate psychological barrier. Escape seems impossible. Hope feels even more distant. And for the regime, control becomes effortless. By the time Hafez al-Assad solidified his power in the 1970s, Tadmor had already gained a reputation as a place where political dissidents might be held. But under Assad's rule, its role changed drastically. What had been a detention site slowly transformed into a tool of fear, a mechanism for crushing rebellion before it could even begin. The Assad government understood something crucial about repression. Fear is more powerful when it is rooted in the unknown. And Tadmor was the perfect unknown. Most Syrians never saw the prison, but they heard rumors, whispers of torture so severe it defied imagination, stories of prisoners who entered but never came out, tales of rooms where screams were never heard because walls swallowed every sound. The architecture of the prison, based on its original military design, made this transformation even easier. Long corridors could be used to transport prisoners without witnesses. Basement rooms could be turned into torture chambers. Baroque-style buildings could become overcrowded cells holding hundreds of men at a time. The thick stone structure resisted heat during the day and held cold during the night, amplifying the harsh desert climate. Everything about Tadmor's physical design contributed to suffering, even before any human cruelty was added. Its remoteness also shaped the psychology of those held inside. Prisoners knew they were far from civilization, far from help, and far from any chance of being rescued. The desert outside acted as a natural barrier. Even if someone managed to escape the walls, they would face a barren landscape with no water, no shelter, and no direction. Guards often used this psychological trap as part of their intimidation, reminding prisoners that even freedom would mean death under the scorching sun. During this time, the prison's purpose became intensely political. It was not simply a place to hold ordinary criminals, it was a place to bury opposition. Students, activists, intellectuals, journalists, and anyone suspected of challenging the regime could be taken to Tadmor without trial. Families often had no information about their loved ones, no official charges, and no confirmation if the arrested person was even alive. Tadmor's secrecy was part of its power. The unknown became a weapon. By the early 1980s, Tadmor Prison had fully evolved into a symbol of state terror. Its location in the desert made it invisible to the world, while its origins as a military site gave it the perfect structure for absolute control. The contrast between the beauty of ancient Palmyra and the horror of Tadmor created a haunting duality, a reminder that even in places filled with the remnants of great civilizations, darkness can take root and grow. Tadmor Prison did not earn its reputation overnight. It took years of brutality, silence, and human suffering for the world to recognize this desert fortress as one of the most feared institutions in modern history. The phrase, "one of the world's most brutal prisons," is not an exaggeration created for dramatic effect. It is a summary of countless testimonies, survivor accounts, human rights investigations, and whispered stories passed between families who feared even speaking the name Tadmor aloud. Understanding how Tadmor gained this gruesome reputation requires looking at how brutality became embedded into the prison's culture, how the regime weaponized fear, and how the world slowly began to understand the scale of what was happening inside those walls. Tadmor Prison's reputation began to form under the rule of Hafez al-Assad, who seized power in 1970. Assad's regime was built on a foundation of absolute control, and for authoritarian systems, fear is a vital currency. Tadmor became one of the most effective tools for spreading that fear. Unlike other prisons that housed a mixture of common criminals and political detainees, Tadmor developed a unique identity. It became the destination for those the regime considered enemies of the state. This label was intentionally vague. Anyone suspected of opposition, students, scholars, activists, members of the Muslim Brotherhood, political thinkers, or even citizens who were unlucky enough to be associated with the wrong person, could find themselves on a transport truck heading toward the desert. The prison's reputation grew darker because of the complete absence of accountability inside its walls. Guards operated without rules, without oversight, and without fear of punishment. Files could disappear, prisoners could vanish, and the outside world had no access to witnesses. It was this complete lack of transparency that allowed Tadmor to evolve from a detention center into something far more sinister. Torture was not an unfortunate side effect. It was the foundation of the prison system. Former prisoners have described how torture was used not merely to extract information but to break the spirit, to erase individuality, and to send a terrifying message to anyone who might consider opposing the regime. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International, documented countless methods of torture used inside Tadmor. Survivors recounted being beaten with metal rods, whipped with cables, electrocuted, starved, and forced into painful stress positions for hours or days at a time. One of the most notorious techniques was the dulab, the tire method, where a prisoner was forced into a car tire, folded unnaturally and beaten repeatedly. Another method involved hanging prisoners from the ceiling by their wrists for extended periods. Some methods left visible scars. Others left deep psychological wounds that survivors still carry decades later. The prison's brutality extended far beyond physical torture. Psychological torment was woven into daily life. Prisoners were forbidden from speaking to each other. They lived in constant uncertainty, never sure if a guard's footsteps meant food or another beating. New arrivals often described the first weeks as the most terrifying, not because the torture was more intense, but because the silence and unpredictability created overwhelming fear. In Tadmor, even sleep offered no escape. Guards would enter cells at night for random punishment rounds, beating prisoners without reason. A major turning point in Tadmor's global reputation came in June 1980, after an assassination attempt on President Hafez al-Assad. The regime responded with unprecedented brutality, ordering a massacre inside Tadmor. In the early hours of the morning, soldiers from the defense brigade stormed the prison and executed hundreds of inmates, many in their sleep. The massacre left a horror-filled legacy and became one of the darkest chapters in Syrian history. Survivors and defected soldiers later provided testimonies that described the brutality. Men shot in their cells, bodies piled in hallways, and entire sections of the prison wiped out in a matter of hours. This event cemented Tadmor's place in global memory as a symbol of the regime's cruelty. As the years passed, more accounts began to emerge. Syrians who fled the country carried stories of what they witnessed or heard inside Tadmor. International organizations published reports that shed light on conditions. Overcrowded cells, minimal food, lack of medical care, and systemic abuse that often resulted in death. Each new testimony strengthened the prison's already horrific reputation. The physical structure of the prison also contributed to the fear it inspired. Its desert location made it isolated from urban life, allowing guards to operate without fear of interruption. Its thick walls, long corridors, and harsh climate created an environment where suffering could be controlled, hidden, and prolonged. In many authoritarian regimes, prisons become symbols, but Tadmor became something more. It became a warning. Even Syrians who had never seen the prison felt its presence in their lives. Parents used the name to caution their children. Activists whispered it to each other in meetings. Ordinary citizens tried to avoid conversations that might draw suspicion, fearing that one careless sentence could end with a one-way journey to the desert. Over time, Tadmor's reputation expanded beyond Syria's borders. International journalists, historians, and human rights advocates began referring to it as one of the harshest detention centers in the world. The reality is that Tadmor earned its reputation not simply through torture, but through the scale, systemization, and purpose of that torture. It was not chaotic brutality, it was organized cruelty implemented to maintain political power. Its reputation became a symbol of what happens when a system is allowed to operate without oversight, accountability, or humanity. To understand the full magnitude of Tadmor Prison's cruelty, one must examine its darkest era. The period under Hafez al-Assad, whose rule reshaped the Syrian state into a tightly controlled authoritarian system where dissent was not merely discouraged, it was hunted, crushed, and erased. Tadmor became the centerpiece of this machinery of fear. It was not just a prison, it was a message carved into the desert, a reminder of what awaited anyone who dared to challenge the regime. Under Hafez, the prison evolved into a living embodiment of state terror, a place where law, humanity, and dignity ceased to exist the moment a prisoner crossed through its gates. Hafez al-Assad rose to power in 1970 through the corrective movement, a bloodless coup that brought the Ba'ath party firmly under his command. From the beginning, he sought absolute control over political life in Syria. The regime quickly tightened its grip over institutions, the military, and intelligence services. And to maintain this control, Hafez relied heavily on a network of prisons, detention centers, and secret police units. Among them, Tadmor stood out because it served a very specific purpose. It was where the regime sent its most feared enemies, real or imagined, to disappear. During this period, Tadmor did not function as a normal prison. It was placed under the authority of military intelligence, which meant that judicial oversight did not apply. Many prisoners had no formal charges, no access to lawyers, and no trials. They were arrested based on suspicion, political affiliation, or simply because someone in power wanted them gone. In such an environment, the rule of law became irrelevant. What mattered was control, and Tadmor was the most ruthless instrument of that control. Under Hafez, the regime's security apparatus was structured around the belief that fear was more effective than persuasion. Dissent was considered an existential threat. Any criticism, even private conversations, could be interpreted as opposition. As a result, thousands of Syrians were arrested throughout the 1970s and 1980s. Many were taken directly to Tadmor. Others were transported there after interrogation in intelligence branches. Once inside, prisoners quickly learned that survival depended not on strength or resistance, but on submission and silence. The brutality under Hafez was not spontaneous. It was systematic. Guards were trained to enforce obedience through terror. Daily life in Tadmor was governed by fear, unpredictability, and violence. Torture was not a punishment but a routine part of the prison's operation. It served multiple purposes: extracting confessions, breaking the will of the opposition, and reinforcing the power structure within the prison. Prisoners were beaten upon arrival in the infamous welcome party, a brutal initiation involving hours of continuous whipping and kicking. Beyond physical abuse, Hafez's regime used psychological warfare inside the prison. Prisoners were kept in a state of constant uncertainty, never knowing when they would be called for interrogation, beaten without cause, or simply dragged away and never seen again. Many prisoners reported that the psychological torment was worse than the physical pain. It created an environment where hope was crushed before it could take root. The Assad regime's conflict with the Muslim Brotherhood in the late 1970s and early 1980s further intensified the cruelty inside Tadmor. Members of the Brotherhood, or anyone suspected of supporting them, were targeted, arrested, and funneled into the prison system. Tadmor quickly became filled with political detainees, many of whom were young students, teachers, and clerics. They faced some of the harshest conditions and most violent treatment. The regime viewed them as ideological enemies, and Tadmor was the arena where this battle was fought with absolute brutality. The peak of the terror came in June 1980, after an assassination attempt on Hafez al-Assad carried out by members of the Muslim Brotherhood. The regime's response was swift and horrifying. In a coordinated attack known later as the Tadmor Massacre, Units of the Defense Brigade stormed the prison at dawn and executed hundreds of prisoners in their cells. The massacre was a message to the entire nation. Opposition would not simply be punished, it would be annihilated. This single event transformed Tadmor from a place of fear into a symbol of state violence. It marked the moment when Syria, and the world, began to fully grasp the depth of brutality occurring behind its walls. Yet even after the massacre, the cycle of terror continued. Prisoners remained under constant surveillance, and even minor infractions resulted in severe punishment. Many prisoners died from untreated illnesses, starvation, or injuries inflicted by guards. Others simply disappeared, their families never receiving confirmation of their fate. What made the reign of terror under Hafez so effective was not only the violence but the secrecy. The regime hid its crimes behind walls, desert sands, and silence. Syrians whispered about Tadmor with fear. Families avoided asking questions. The name itself became a threat. Be careful or you'll end up in Tadmor. It was a fear so deep that it shaped an entire generation's understanding of power. Tadmor's story during Hafez al-Assad's rule is one of absolute domination. The prison was not a rogue institution, it was a deliberate extension of the regime's ideology, an ideology that believed dissent must be crushed, individuality must be erased, and power must be preserved at any cost. Inside Tadmor Prison, torture was not an exception. It was not a tactic used occasionally, nor was it a method reserved for specific prisoners. Torture was the daily rhythm of life, woven into the very structure of the prison's existence. It was the system. Every guard was trained in it, every prisoner expected it, and every inch of Tadmor's concrete walls absorbed the echoes of its cruelty. To understand the nightmare that unfolded within those walls, one must recognize that torture was not random violence. It was institutionalized, systematic, and deliberate, designed to strip prisoners of their identity, dignity, and humanity. The torture began the moment a prisoner arrived. New prisoners were greeted with what survivors called the welcome party. This was a brutal initiation consisting of hours of non-stop beatings with sticks, metal rods, electric cables, and boots. Prisoners were forced to walk through a corridor lined with guards, each one striking them as they passed. Few arrived at their assigned cells without broken ribs, deep cuts, or severe internal injuries. The purpose of this ritual was clear: to break the prisoner mentally before they even began their sentence, to establish dominance, and to remind them that pain would be a constant companion. One of the most notorious torture methods used in Tadmor was the dulab, or tire method. Prisoners were forced to curl their bodies into a rubber tire, their hands tied behind their backs or bound at the ankles. In this painfully contorted position, guards beat them on the feet, legs, and back with sticks or cables. Survivors recall the dulab as one of the most excruciating experiences, not only because of the physical pain but because the position prevented them from seeing where the blows were coming from, adding a layer of psychological terror to every strike. Another commonly used method was the falaka, a form of foot whipping. Prisoners were tied down and beaten on the soles of their feet until they could no longer walk. The guards often mocked them afterward, forcing them to run or stand despite the agony. Many prisoners reported long-term nerve damage, infections, and chronic pain as a result of repeated falaka sessions. Some never fully recovered. Electrocution was also widespread. Metal wires were attached to sensitive parts of the body, ears, genitals, tongue, or fingers, and electric shocks were administered in sudden, unpredictable bursts. The shocks caused involuntary muscle spasms, burns, and extreme pain. Some prisoners lost consciousness. Others were revived only to endure the torture again. The unpredictability of the shocks added psychological terror, as prisoners braced themselves for pain that could strike at any moment. Hanging torture methods were equally brutal. One of the most feared was the shebe. Prisoners were suspended from the ceiling by their wrists, sometimes with their feet barely touching the ground, sometimes completely elevated. They could be left in this agonizing position for hours or days. The strain on the shoulders and arms caused dislocations, nerve damage, and in many cases permanent disability. Guards walked through the corridors, striking suspended prisoners as they passed, adding further torment to an already unbearable condition. Starvation and deprivation played a central role in the torture system. Food was scarce, dirty, and barely edible. Water was rationed. Medical care was non-existent. Prisoners weakened by malnutrition were more vulnerable to physical abuse, and guards used hunger as a method of control. Some prisoners reported being denied food for days as punishment for minor infractions, such as looking up without permission or speaking out of turn. Torture in Tadmor was not limited to physical techniques. Psychological torture was equally devastating. Prisoners lived in a constant state of fear, never knowing when their names would be called for interrogation or punishment. Even the sound of footsteps in the hallway caused panic. Silence was enforced with violence. A whispered word could lead to a beating. Some prisoners were forced to watch others being tortured, a method designed to break their will and remind them that no one was safe. Sleep deprivation was also common. Guards frequently entered cells at night, shouting, beating prisoners, or forcing them to stand for long periods. Lights were kept on or suddenly turned off as a form of sensory manipulation. Prisoners sometimes went days without proper rest, weakening their bodies and minds. Humiliation was another tool used to break prisoners psychologically. Guards forced them to perform degrading acts, insulted their families, and denied them basic human dignity. Some prisoners were stripped naked during interrogations. Others were forced into positions meant to dehumanize them. In Tadmor, humiliation was not an occasional tactic. It was an everyday reality. Medical neglect was also a form of torture. Prisoners with severe wounds were left untreated. Infections spread quickly in the overcrowded, filthy cells. Many prisoners suffered from untreated fractures, head injuries, or open wounds. For the guards, this was intentional. Every untreated injury was another way to prolong suffering. The torture system inside Tadmor was effective because it attacked every part of a prisoner's existence. It broke the body, shattered the mind, and stripped away any sense of self. Under such conditions, time lost meaning, hope became a distant memory, and survival depended on enduring pain that never seemed to end. Tadmor's torture practices became infamous not because they were unique, but because of their scale, frequency, and the total lack of restraint. Every prisoner experienced torture. Every day brought new fear. Every corner of the prison echoed with pain. The story of Tadmor Prison cannot be told without confronting one of the darkest and most horrifying chapters in Syria's modern history, the mass executions, culminating in the infamous 1980 Tadmor Massacre. This event is remembered not only for its brutality but for its cold, calculated purpose, a display of power meant to silence an entire nation. What happened inside Tadmor on that June morning was not an act of desperation or chaos. It was an organized operation carried out with military precision, designed to send a message that opposition to the regime would be met not just with punishment, but with total annihilation. To understand the massacre, one must look at the political climate of Syria at the time. In the late 1970s, Hafez al-Assad's regime was locked in a deadly confrontation with the Muslim Brotherhood, a political and religious organization that opposed the authoritarian rule of the Ba'ath Party. Tensions escalated steadily as underground networks mobilized supporters, carrying out attacks, protests, and resistance operations around the country. The Assad regime responded with increasing ferocity, arresting thousands suspected of affiliation with the Brotherhood or simply being within their social circles. These arrests filled prisons across the country, but Tadmor became the primary holding site for those considered the most serious threats. By 1980, the prison was packed with political detainees, many young, many innocent, many held without trial, and all living in brutal conditions. What none of them knew was that they were about to become part of one of the most infamous crimes committed under the Assad regime. On June 26, 1980, an event outside Tadmor set the stage for what was to come. Members of the Muslim Brotherhood attempted to assassinate President Hafez al-Assad in Damascus. The attempt failed, but the regime's response was immediate and ruthless. In the early hours of the following morning, units from the defense brigades, an elite military force commanded by Rifat al-Assad, the president's brother, boarded helicopters and flew to Tadmor Prison. Their mission was simple and horrifying: eliminate as many prisoners as possible. As dawn approached, the soldiers landed inside the prison grounds. The prisoners, unaware of what was coming, were locked in their cells. What unfolded next was a methodical slaughter that left an indelible mark on Syrian history. Soldiers moved from block to block, entering cells and firing indiscriminately at the sleeping inmates. Some prisoners were lined up and shot, others were killed where they lay on the floor. Testimonies from former guards and defectors describe scenes of unimaginable horror: bodies piled on top of each other, cells drenched in blood, and corridors echoing with screams that were quickly silenced by gunfire. The massacre lasted only a few hours, but by the time it was over, hundreds of prisoners had been killed. The exact numbers remain debated, as the Assad regime kept all records hidden, but most human rights organizations estimate the death toll to be between 500 and 1,000 men. Some accounts suggest even higher numbers. What is certain is that very few survived, and those who did emerged scarred by the memory of a morning that even seasoned investigators struggle to describe. What made the massacre particularly chilling was its deliberate nature. This was not a chaotic riot response or a spontaneous act of revenge by angry soldiers. It was a premeditated operation ordered at the highest levels of government. The use of elite military units, the timing of the attack, and the efficiency with which it was carried out all point to a calculated decision meant to crush any remaining spirit of resistance. Tadmor became the stage for a message meant not only for the prisoners but for the entire Syrian population. The regime would tolerate no challenge, and mercy would not be part of its vocabulary. After the massacre, the regime attempted to erase evidence of the crime. Bodies were removed hastily and buried in mass graves. Families were never informed. No official statements were made. Syrian newspapers carried no reports. Silence became part of the punishment. For years, the details of what happened inside Tadmor on that day circulated only as whispers among survivors, defectors, and human rights activists working in exile. It took decades for the full truth to begin surfacing in documented reports. Yet the massacre was only one event in a broader pattern of execution and torture within Tadmor. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, prisoners were routinely executed without trial. Some were hanged in courtyards during the early hours before sunrise. Others were taken from their cells at night, lined up against walls, and shot without warning. Many were simply declared deceased without explanation, their families receiving no body, no cause of death, and no acknowledgement. These mass executions contributed significantly to Tadmor's reputation as a place where life could end at any moment. Prisoners lived in constant fear, knowing that the next day, or even the next hour, could bring a call from a guard that would lead them to their death. This unpredictability was part of the psychological strategy, to create an environment where hope had no place, and survival was a daily miracle. The 1980 massacre became a defining symbol of the Assad regime's brutality. It showed that Tadmor was not merely a prison, it was an execution ground. And it demonstrated that the Syrian government was willing to use overwhelming violence against defenseless prisoners as a tool of political messaging. Life inside Tadmor Prison was not merely harsh, it was a carefully engineered environment of suffering designed to strip prisoners of every shred of dignity, hope, and humanity. The cells themselves were the first instruments of oppression. Overcrowded, dark, and suffocating, they transformed a basic living space into a chamber of constant fear. Prisoners were often crammed together with dozens, sometimes hundreds of other men, forced to share spaces so small that movement was nearly impossible. Each cell functioned as a microcosm of the prison's broader system of cruelty, confined, surveilled, and utterly controlled. The claustrophobia combined with the oppressive weight of despair made every day a struggle not only against the guards and torture but against the environment itself. Sanitation in Tadmor was almost non-existent. Toilets, when available, were filthy, often clogged, and shared among many prisoners. Many cells lacked proper drainage, meaning that human waste often accumulated in corners, creating unbearable odors and breeding disease. Water was scarce and rationed, with prisoners often forced to drink from contaminated sources. The combination of poor hygiene, overcrowding, and limited access to clean water created ideal conditions for the spread of illness. Dysentery, infections, skin diseases, and respiratory problems were common, and medical care was minimal or entirely absent. Guards frequently ignored pleas for treatment, allowing even minor injuries to fester into life-threatening conditions. In some cases, deliberate neglect was itself a form of punishment, a way to weaken prisoners' bodies and spirits over time. Darkness was another constant in Tadmor's cells. Windows were few or entirely absent, and artificial lighting was dim and irregular. This created a disorienting sense of timelessness. Prisoners lost track of day and night, with some reporting that they could not remember when they last saw sunlight. The lack of light also contributed to a psychological deterioration. Depression, anxiety, and despair became daily companions. Darkness amplified fear, making every sound, from the shuffle of feet outside the cell to the distant scream of another prisoner, seem far more threatening than it might have been in a normal environment. Shadows could hide the approach of guards, and the inability to see what was coming created a constant state of hypervigilance, where even a whisper or a cough could invite punishment. The guards in Tadmor were another ever-present threat. Brutal, unpredictable, and often sadistic, they maintained control through fear and violence. Prisoners were under constant surveillance, forced to obey even the smallest orders, and punished for the slightest perceived infraction. Whistling, murmuring, or even exchanging glances with another prisoner could trigger beatings. Guards frequently conducted random inspections, during which prisoners were humiliated, stripped, or beaten. The presence of these guards reinforced a psychological hierarchy. Absolute power over life and death rested in their hands. The prisoners, meanwhile, were powerless, unable to defend themselves, and acutely aware that any act of resistance could result in death. Overcrowding intensified these hardships. Prisoners were packed so tightly that personal space did not exist. Sleeping arrangements were improvised, with prisoners often forced to lie on the floor or share thin mats with strangers. Privacy was non-existent, and even performing basic bodily functions carried the risk of exposure or punishment. The lack of space contributed to tension, conflict, and fear among prisoners themselves. In such conditions, human relationships were strained, and mistrust became a survival mechanism. Prisoners learned quickly that vulnerability could be fatal, whether from guards or from fellow inmates seeking advantage in the struggle to survive. Daily survival became the sole focus for those inside Tadmor. Routine activities that might be considered ordinary in the outside world, eating, sleeping, and walking, were fraught with danger and required constant vigilance. Meals, when provided, were meager, often spoiled or contaminated. Hunger was a constant companion, and prisoners were forced to eat quickly and silently under the watchful eyes of guards. Those who complained or ate too slowly risked beatings or confiscation of food. Sleep, too, was a luxury, interrupted frequently by guards' patrols, random beatings, or the cries of fellow prisoners. Even rest was weaponized, serving as both punishment and psychological control. Isolation and loneliness compounded the suffering. Although prisoners were physically close to one another, meaningful interaction was dangerous. Conversation was often prohibited, and any attempt to communicate could lead to severe punishment. Solitude in such harsh conditions contributed to mental deterioration. Many prisoners reported experiencing hallucinations, paranoia, and extreme anxiety. The mind, deprived of social support and subjected to relentless stress, began to deteriorate in tandem with the body. The cells were also spaces where fear was constant and inescapable. The knowledge that torture could come at any moment, that interrogations might be sudden and brutal, and that death could be immediate created a climate of perpetual terror. Prisoners had no sense of control over their environment or their fate. Even minor gestures of defiance could trigger retribution, reinforcing the notion that their lives were entirely at the mercy of the guards. The environment itself, from the suffocating walls to the oppressive silence punctuated by screams, became an instrument of psychological torment, ensuring that fear was an inseparable part of daily life. Life inside Tadmor cells, therefore, cannot be described merely as harsh conditions. It was a meticulously engineered system of oppression. Every element, darkness, overcrowding, poor sanitation, brutality, isolation, and hunger, worked together to destroy the human spirit. Prisoners' bodies weakened, their minds frayed, and their sense of identity eroded, leaving only the fundamental instinct to survive, however barely. Survival was not measured in freedom or victory, but in making it through each day with life intact. While the physical brutality of Tadmor Prison has long been documented, it is the psychological trauma inflicted upon its prisoners that reveals the full scope of its horror. Life inside Tadmor was not merely a test of physical endurance, it was an unrelenting assault on the human mind. The prison was designed to break not just the body but the spirit, systematically eroding hope, identity, and the capacity to trust. Survivors often describe experiences that transcend conventional definitions of suffering, a psychological landscape of fear, anxiety, isolation, and despair that continued long after their release, sometimes lasting a lifetime. One of the most devastating aspects of Tadmor was the constant uncertainty under which prisoners lived. In a typical prison, inmates may have routines, schedules, or the knowledge of when interrogations or punishments will occur. Tadmor offered none of these comforts. Prisoners never knew when they might be called for questioning, subjected to torture, or taken away to be executed. This unpredictability created a state of hypervigilance, where every sound, shadow, or footstep could provoke terror. Guards often exploited this fear deliberately, moving silently through corridors, appearing suddenly at cell doors, or leaving a presence just out of sight to create tension. The constant expectation of violence shattered a prisoner's sense of normalcy, leaving them in a perpetual state of dread. Isolation was another key tool in the psychological manipulation of prisoners. Although cells were overcrowded, meaningful social interaction was often forbidden. Speaking to another inmate, sharing information, or offering comfort could result in severe punishment. This enforced solitude created feelings of alienation and helplessness. Prisoners were physically present with others but emotionally and psychologically cut off. Many described the paradox of being surrounded by humans yet feeling completely alone. In some cases, this isolation was compounded by solitary confinement, where individuals were locked in small, dark cells for days or weeks on end, sometimes without food or water, further intensifying the mental strain. The methods of torture themselves inflicted profound psychological damage. Techniques such as the dulab, tire, method, electrocution, hanging, beatings, and sexual humiliation were designed not only to cause pain but to create lasting fear. Survivors reported experiencing nightmares, flashbacks, and panic attacks that mirrored their experiences in the prison. The anticipation of these tortures often caused prisoners to experience stress reactions comparable to those triggered by the torture itself. In this way, the mind became a constant battlefield, unable to rest even when the body was left alone. Tadmor also employed psychological manipulation and humiliation as a form of control. Prisoners were stripped of personal identity through the use of numbers instead of names, uniforms instead of personal clothing, and regimented, dehumanizing routines. Guards mocked prisoners, forced them into degrading positions, and compelled them to witness the suffering or deaths of others. For many, the trauma of observing such events was as intense as the trauma of direct physical abuse. Seeing fellow inmates tortured or executed reinforced the perception that no one was safe and that resistance was futile, deepening feelings of hopelessness and fear. The cumulative effect of these experiences was long-lasting psychological trauma. Many former prisoners of Tadmor report post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, depression, anxiety, and social withdrawal even decades after their release. The trauma was not limited to the individual. It extended to families who often received no information about the fate of their loved ones. Waiting for news that never came created anticipatory grief, a prolonged psychological torment that accompanied the fear of torture or death inside the prison. Even after release, survivors struggled with reintegration, finding it difficult to trust others, maintain relationships, or function in normal society. The prison environment itself reinforced psychological distress. The sensory deprivation caused by darkness, silence, and confinement distorted prisoners' perception of reality. Many reported losing track of days, months, or even years. Time in Tadmor became a blur, with the mind forced into a near-constant state of anxiety and alertness. The absence of natural light and normal social cues contributed to hallucinations and a disconnection from reality. Overcrowding, noise, and unsanitary conditions added further layers of mental strain, ensuring that the trauma was inescapable and compounded daily. Fear of death and uncertainty about the future were central to Tadmor's psychological warfare. Prisoners never knew if they would survive the night or be executed in the next hour. This existential anxiety created long-term mental damage. For some, the mere thought of returning to certain parts of Syria or encountering figures associated with the regime triggered panic, indicating the enduring nature of the trauma. Survivors often experience hypervigilance, nightmares, and recurring flashbacks decades after their imprisonment, illustrating that the mental scars of Tadmor were often deeper and more enduring than the physical ones. Even outside the prison, the psychological effects of Tadmor persisted. Former inmates faced challenges in rebuilding their lives as the trauma left them distrustful, socially isolated, and haunted by memories too painful to share. Some turned to silence, unable to articulate the horrors they had endured, while others dedicated their lives to activism, using their trauma as a catalyst for advocacy. Regardless of the path they chose, the shadow of Tadmor remained, a constant reminder of the profound mental cruelty inflicted within its walls. Tadmor Prison's notoriety was not confined to Syria. Its horrors gradually captured the attention of the international community, provoking widespread condemnation from human rights organizations, journalists, and foreign governments. For decades, the Assad regime worked meticulously to conceal the extent of abuse within Tadmor, using secrecy, intimidation, and misinformation to shield the prison from scrutiny. Yet, despite these efforts, testimonies from survivors, defectors, and escaped prisoners slowly emerged, shedding light on a system of torture, executions, and repression so severe that it drew global outrage. Tadmor became a symbol not only of domestic oppression but of international human rights violations, exposing the moral and political failures of the global community to intervene effectively. The first wave of international attention came from human rights organizations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. In the 1970s and 1980s, these organizations began collecting testimonies from Syrian refugees who had endured imprisonment or had family members detained in Tadmor. They documented stories of physical abuse, psychological torture, forced labor, starvation, and mass executions. Detailed reports described methods like electrocution, the tire method, dulab, the shebe, suspension torture, and the widespread practice of solitary confinement. These reports also noted the regime's systematic use of Tadmor as a tool of political repression, targeting not criminals, but dissenters, intellectuals, activists, and perceived ideological opponents. The accumulation of these accounts painted a picture of an institution that had become one of the most brutal prisons in the world, sparking outrage among international observers. Journalists also played a critical role in exposing Tadmor's reality, although access to the prison was tightly controlled and nearly impossible. Many stories were based on interviews with survivors who had fled Syria, often risking their lives to speak out. These first-hand accounts described not only the physical and psychological torment of inmates, but also the broader climate of fear imposed on Syrian society. International media coverage amplified Tadmor's infamy, drawing attention to a regime that had long operated in the shadows, away from the scrutiny of the global public. Photographs, written testimonies, and later video interviews allowed outsiders to understand that the prison was not a distant or abstract threat, but a very real and systematic tool of oppression. Foreign governments, particularly those concerned with human rights, expressed condemnation, though practical intervention was limited. Western governments and the United Nations frequently cited Tadmor in their human rights reports on Syria, condemning the systematic torture, unlawful detention, and extrajudicial killings. Diplomatic pressure was occasionally applied, urging the Syrian government to improve conditions or allow independent monitoring. However, geopolitical interests often muted responses. Syria's strategic position in the Middle East, combined with its alliances and internal stability concerns, meant that many governments were hesitant to take strong punitive action. As a result, while Tadmor was widely criticized in principle, it continued to operate with relative impunity for decades. One of the most significant elements of international condemnation was the documentation of Tadmor's massacres, especially the 1980 mass execution of prisoners following the assassination attempt on Hafez al-Assad. Reports collected from survivors and defectors detailed the killing of hundreds, if not thousands, of prisoners in a single day. The massacre became a central example cited by human rights groups as evidence of state-sponsored crimes against humanity. International outrage centered on both the scale and cold efficiency of the killings, which were carried out systematically, leaving few survivors to testify. These accounts made it increasingly difficult for the global community to ignore the reality of Tadmor, even as the Syrian regime sought to erase evidence and deny responsibility. Beyond formal condemnation, Tadmor Prison became a symbolic reference in global discourse on political oppression. Scholars, activists, and journalists used the prison as an example of the extremes of authoritarian repression. Tadmor's name became synonymous with systematic torture, arbitrary detention, and state terror. Reports often drew comparisons with other notorious prisons worldwide, highlighting the unique combination of physical brutality, psychological torment, and political purpose that defined Tadmor. This symbolic significance amplified international awareness and fueled ongoing campaigns advocating for accountability and justice for survivors. Despite these condemnations, the Assad regime maintained strict control over access and information. International investigators were rarely allowed inside, and official Syrian records were inaccessible. The regime's ability to shield Tadmor from direct observation meant that much of the world's knowledge relied on indirect sources: survivor testimonies, defector reports, and refugee narratives. This created a tension between widespread condemnation and limited action. Governments and organizations could denounce the abuses in principle, but direct intervention was complicated by diplomatic, military, and strategic concerns. The condemnation of Tadmor also inspired a broader movement within the human rights community to document and expose similar abuses worldwide. Tadmor became a case study in how authoritarian regimes can use prisons not just to punish, but to terrorize, intimidate, and eliminate political opposition. Its infamy reinforced the importance of documenting violations, collecting survivor testimonies, and advocating for accountability through international mechanisms such as the United Nations Human Rights Council. Tadmor's story highlighted the challenge of confronting state-sanctioned cruelty in situations where global powers hesitate to intervene due to geopolitical calculations. In summary, international condemnation of Tadmor Prison was both a moral and political response to systemic abuse. While documentation, journalism, and advocacy raised global awareness, the prison continued to function largely unimpeded for decades. Nonetheless, these condemnations helped ensure that Tadmor's history would not be forgotten, preserving the memory of the victims and creating a foundation for future calls for justice and accountability. Tadmor Prison's story does not end with the horrors inflicted on its prisoners during the decades of Assad's rule. The physical destruction of the facility and its later partial reopening represent another chapter in its complex and tragic history. While much of the world was already aware of Tadmor's infamy, its destruction in the 21st century under the chaos of civil war and extremist occupation added a new layer to its legacy. The prison's demolition did not erase the memory of its atrocities. Instead, it transformed the site into a symbol of the enduring consequences of tyranny and conflict. The events leading to Tadmor's destruction were closely tied to the Syrian Civil War, which began in 2011. As the conflict escalated, different factions vied for control of key territories, including the ancient city of Palmyra and its surrounding desert. Tadmor, located near Palmyra, became strategically important. However, it was also vulnerable due to the weakened central authority and the ongoing chaos of war. In 2015, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, captured the prison, marking the beginning of a dramatic and destructive chapter in its existence. ISIS's occupation of the facility brought deliberate devastation. The group reportedly blown up significant portions of the prison, claiming it was an act against a symbol of Assad's tyranny. While some argued that ISIS sought to destroy a site of historical and political significance, the act was also emblematic of the broader chaos consuming Syria at the time. The destruction was not selective or surgical. Entire buildings, walls, and cells were reduced to rubble. Security installations were dismantled, and any remaining infrastructure was left in ruins. For the world, the destruction of Tadmor became a shocking visual representation of both the war's brutality and the fragility of even the most notorious state institutions under conflict. Before ISIS's arrival, Tadmor had already become a shadow of its former self due to neglect, underfunding, and the pressures of a country at war. Overcrowding, poor maintenance, and sporadic staffing had left the prison vulnerable. When extremist forces captured the area, the prison's physical vulnerabilities made its destruction possible, while the broader instability in Syria ensured that reconstruction was unlikely in the near term. Photographs and videos taken after ISIS's occupation reveal a facility that was no longer merely a place of terror but a ruin, symbolic of a failed state and a brutal past. After the defeat of ISIS in the region, the Syrian government regained control over Palmyra and Tadmor. There were reports of efforts to reopen portions of the prison, although the scale and purpose of its reopening remain unclear. It is believed that some parts of the facility were restored to serve as detention centers for new prisoners, while other sections were left in ruins. The reopening represents a complex reality. The site that once housed torture, mass executions, and political repression now continues to exist, albeit in a changed political and structural context. Some observers argue that reopening any part of Tadmor risks perpetuating the legacy of fear associated with the location, while others claim it is necessary for law enforcement and state security purposes in a post-war Syria. The destruction of Tadmor also sparked international debate about the preservation of sites of atrocity. On one hand, the ruins serve as a stark historical record, a reminder of the crimes committed within its walls and a testament to the suffering endured by thousands of prisoners. On the other hand, the devastation removes much of the physical evidence that human rights organizations and historians rely on to document past abuses. Satellite images, survivor testimonies, and remaining fragments of the facility have become crucial in reconstructing the prison's history, even as the original structure lies in ruins. The duality of destruction and partial reopening creates a layered legacy. Physically, Tadmor no longer functions entirely as it once did, but its symbolic power endures. For survivors, families of victims, and human rights advocates, the ruins are a powerful reminder of what occurred inside. The prison's partial reopening signals that the state continues to wield control over detention facilities, but the shadow of its past atrocities complicates any narrative of rehabilitation or reform. Tadmor's history demonstrates that physical destruction cannot erase psychological, historical, or moral scars. Furthermore, the prison's destruction intersects with the broader cultural and historical significance of the surrounding region. Tadmor sits near Palmyra, one of the most historically significant archaeological sites in the Middle East. The proximity of a site associated with human rights atrocities to a UNESCO World Heritage location creates a stark juxtaposition, the brilliance of human civilization alongside the depths of human cruelty. This contrast has been highlighted in reports and media coverage, underscoring the tragedy of Tadmor not only as a prison but as a symbol of the broader destruction wrought by political violence, civil war, and extremist occupation in Syria. The story of Tadmor's destruction and partial reopening also raises questions about memory, justice, and accountability. Even as buildings were reduced to rubble, the international community continued to investigate, document, and report on the crimes that occurred there. Survivor testimonies, photographs, and historical records remain critical for ensuring that the prison's horrors are not forgotten. The destruction complicates efforts to hold perpetrators accountable, but it cannot erase the documented human suffering, the psychological scars carried by survivors, or the historical record that has been preserved through years of investigation. Tadmor Prison stands today not merely as a physical location in the Syrian desert, but as a powerful symbol of oppression, fear, and the consequences of unchecked authoritarian rule. Its walls, whether intact, ruined, or partially reopened, embody decades of human suffering, state-sanctioned terror, and the deliberate destruction of individual dignity. Over time, Tadmor has come to represent more than the sum of its physical atrocities. It has become a cautionary tale, a historical warning about how governments can exploit fear, torture, and imprisonment to maintain absolute control. Its significance extends beyond Syria, resonating with global audiences who study authoritarianism, human rights abuses, and the mechanisms of political repression. The symbolic power of Tadmor lies primarily in its methodical and systemic cruelty. Unlike prisons where violence may be sporadic or confined to a few individuals, Tadmor operated as a mechanism of deliberate state terror. It was a place where ordinary citizens could be stripped of rights, identity, and even hope for survival, all in the service of consolidating political power. The prison's function was not simply to detain but to demonstrate the reach and ruthlessness of the Assad regime, sending a message to anyone who might oppose or question the government. This message was clear. Dissent was not merely dangerous. It was a path to torture, psychological devastation, and often death. The systemic nature of Tadmor's cruelty is what has elevated it from a historical location to a universal symbol of oppression. Tadmor also serves as a psychological and cultural warning. For decades, Syrians spoke of Tadmor in hushed tones, using it as a cautionary reference in conversations about authority and compliance. Parents warned children about misbehavior that could result in detention. Activists whispered its name as a reminder of the consequences of speaking out, and communities lived with the constant awareness that opposition could result in disappearance. In this way, the prison's influence extended far beyond its walls. It shaped the behavior of an entire population, creating a culture of fear that reinforced the regime's control. The symbolic impact of Tadmor is thus inseparable from the broader social and political context in which it operated. It was not only a site of punishment but a pervasive instrument of psychological governance. Globally, Tadmor has come to epitomize the extremes of human rights violations under authoritarian regimes. Historians, journalists, and human rights advocates frequently cite Tadmor as an example of how prisons can be weaponized for political purposes. Its legacy is invoked alongside other infamous detention centers worldwide, such as Alcatraz in the United States, in terms of notoriety, or the Soviet gulags in terms of systemic repression. Though Tadmor's combination of physical, psychological, and political terror gives it a particularly chilling distinction. The prison's infamy underscores the importance of vigilance against abuses of state power, highlighting the mechanisms through which governments can systematically crush opposition, intimidate citizens, and normalize extreme violence. Tadmor's physical presence, or the ruins thereof, reinforces its symbolic weight. Even after partial destruction by ISIS and later reopening, the prison's location remains a stark reminder of the atrocities committed there. The desert site, isolated and imposing, evokes the isolation experienced by prisoners, cut off from the world, subjected to arbitrary violence, and forced to endure unimaginable conditions. For those who visit, study, or learn about Tadmor, the site itself embodies the horrors of totalitarian control, serving as a tangible link between historical accounts, survivor testimonies, and the broader lesson about the dangers of unchecked authority. Furthermore, Tadmor functions as a warning for future generations. Its history demonstrates that institutionalized cruelty is often deliberate and that systemic abuses require both visibility and accountability to prevent recurrence. The prison shows how fear can be normalized, how individuals can be coerced into silence, and how regimes can manipulate structures of law and security to eliminate opposition. The lessons of Tadmor extend far beyond the Syrian context. Anywhere authoritarianism is allowed to flourish unchecked, the same patterns of arbitrary detention, torture, and psychological domination can emerge. By studying Tadmor, scholars, activists, and policymakers are reminded that vigilance, transparency, and international oversight are crucial to protecting human rights and preventing the normalization of terror. Tadmor also holds moral and historical significance. Survivors' testimonies, photographs, and documentation serve as enduring records of the prison's atrocities. Each story, each piece of evidence, reinforces the prison's role as a symbol of what happens when power is concentrated and unchecked. This historical memory ensures that Tadmor is not forgotten, even if its physical structure is altered or destroyed. Remembering Tadmor allows humanity to honor the victims, recognize the consequences of cruelty, and draw lessons about the fragility of justice under authoritarian regimes. Finally, Tadmor's symbolism extends to the international community's responsibility. The prison stands as a stark reminder of how global awareness, documentation, and advocacy are vital in confronting human rights abuses. While the world could not prevent the atrocities that occurred within its walls, Tadmor's enduring infamy continues to inspire investigation, reporting, and activism. Its story serves as both a warning to governments about the consequences of unchecked power and a call to action for the international community to respond when systemic abuse threatens the basic rights and dignity of citizens. In conclusion, Tadmor Prison is far more than a site of historical horror. It is a lasting emblem of oppression, fear, and the human cost of authoritarian rule. Its history, marked by systemic torture, psychological torment, mass executions, and eventual destruction, functions as a warning to both citizens and governments worldwide. Tadmor reminds us that the capacity for cruelty is always present when power is concentrated and unchecked, and that the lessons of history are essential to preventing the repetition of such atrocities in the future. Tadmor Prison is more than just a location in the Syrian desert. It is a haunting reminder of the depths of human cruelty and the consequences of absolute power left unchecked. Its walls witnessed unimaginable suffering, torture, starvation, mass executions, and the psychological torment of thousands of men whose only crime was challenging or existing outside the will of a brutal regime. From its peak under Hafez al-Assad to its destruction and partial reopening, Tadmor stands as both a historical record and a warning. The stories of Tadmor's survivors, the testimonies of families who lost loved ones, and the documentation by human rights organizations all converge to show one undeniable truth: oppression leaves scars that extend far beyond prison walls. The pain, fear, and trauma inflicted here ripple across generations, shaping societies and haunting the collective memory. Yet, by remembering Tadmor, the world confronts both the horror and the resilience of those who endured it, ensuring that the lessons it teaches are not forgotten. Tadmor's legacy is a call to vigilance. It reminds us that injustice thrives in silence, that the unchecked concentration of power can destroy lives with chilling efficiency, and that the fight for human rights is never complete. By studying its history, exposing its truths, and honoring the stories of those who suffered, we strengthen our understanding of freedom, justice, and the moral responsibility to prevent such atrocities in the future. As we reflect on Tadmor Prison, we must recognize it not only as a place of tragedy but as a stark lesson. Oppression can rise in any society if fear, silence, and cruelty go unchallenged. Remembering Tadmor is not just about looking back. It is about carrying its warnings forward, ensuring that the human cost of tyranny is never repeated, and that the voices of the oppressed continue to be heard long after the prison gates have closed forever.